Hello, everyone. My name is Piotr Kononov. I'm the founder of DataIdo, the metadata management tool. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar titled How Data Governance Supports Meeting Data Protection Regulation. Our guest today is Nicola Askham, the data governance coach. She's a data governance trainer or consultant, and she's also a member of the DAMA UK board.
Thank you, Pietro.
Nicola will give you a presentation. It will take about 30 minutes. After that, we'll have a short Q&A session. You can ask your questions during the presentation or in the Q&A session, and we'll read every one of them after the presentation. Okay, so that's it from me. Nicola, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So as Pietro said, I'm a data governance consultant. I'm actually known as the data governance coach, and I'm really lucky. I get to spend my time working with a whole variety of people, helping them be more successful at data governance. Now, when GDPR first came along the horizon, a few years ago now, when it was first mooted, I started getting phone calls from particularly recruitment agents looking for people they could put into roles and help companies deal with this new GDPR thing. I was getting all these recruiters ringing me, and I was saying, well, data governance is not the same as data protection. GDPR is data protection. I'm not your girl. I have nothing to do with this. And then it happened so many times that I thought, I'm going to have to read a bit more about GDPR because I knew so little about it other than it was about data protection. It was the new data protection regulations. So I took a bit of time to read it. And I suddenly realized that actually, if you had a good, solid data governance foundation, then you were well placed to meet some, not all, I hasten to add, of the GDPR regulations. And since then, I have worked with companies looking at the Indian Personal Data Protections Act. And there is also a new one announced this year in Thailand, the Personal Data Protection Act. There's the CCPA in California. I know that Australia are currently looking at revising and improving their protection legislation. So this is happening time and time again. And I think so many people around the globe are telling me that GDPR is being seen as almost like the gold standard that others are now raising the bar of their old legislation to meet. So I wanted to take this opportunity to explain to you how you can use your data governance work to really help your company be more successful and meet whichever data protection regulations you have to meet. And let's be honest, it's very likely that you will have to comply with more than one. And I think that makes it the case even better to use your data governance framework to do that, because it means that you're not doing multiple projects to meet multiple different regulations. You can just get a good solid foundation in place. So let's have a little bit of a look at how we do that. So before we kind of go too far, I always like to do most presentations I ever do about data governance with agreeing what data governance is. One, I'm a data governance geek. I'm a big fan of definitions. But two, and it's not just that, it's that data governance is probably one of the most misunderstood and most misused of all the data management terms. And people aren't always clear on what it was or is. So before I tell you how data governance can help you meet that, I think it's really important that I kind of tell you what it is so that we all start from the same place. So I like to say that data governance is all about proactively managing your data to support your business achieve its strategy and vision. Now, I know that is quite vague in terms of a definition. It doesn't tell you the what. But I think it's really important to focus on the why you're doing data governance. And if you didn't see the last webinar I did for DataIdo, I actually talked a lot there about Simon Sinek and his 3 golden circles. And it's really, really important generally to focus on the why, but very important to do so when you're doing data governance. So don't explain it in what you're going to do. Talk about it to help people understand why they ought to do it. And if you're doing this to meet a data protection regulation, then perhaps you change this wording and you say to help support your business achieve its strategy vision and meet the whichever regulation you need to do. Now, data governance is achieved by just implementing a data governance framework. That sounds nice and easy. And a framework's not that complicated. And in my experience, the more complicated your data governance framework, the less successful you'll be. So in my experience, you just need 3 key things in your framework. You need a policy, and this is the document that says why you have to do data governance and the very high level approach to what you're going to do in your organization. You need some processes because, let's be honest, if you don't have any processes, what's the chances of everybody in your organization doing the same things in the consistent manner that you want them to? And then finally, you need to agree some roles and responsibilities, because you have the problem that people might agree, yes, absolutely, we should manage our data better. We should do data governance. But unless you have made it very clear whose responsibility it is to do something, everybody will assume it's somebody else's problem to worry about the data and not theirs. So we need to have some very clear roles and responsibilities. So that's a very quick, high-level view at looking at what data governance is. Now, the next thing I like to look at is what it's not. Now, that might seem a bit of a strange thing to say to you, but, the things you can see on the screen in front of you now are things that I often come across people getting confused about. So we have data protection, which is the subject of our webinar today, which is why it's helpfully highlighted. Now, the interesting thing is, pre-GDPR, I had a very similar slide to this, and I used to say quite confidently, data protection has nothing to do with data governance. Now, GDPR changed all that, and I will explain that a little bit more why later on in the webinar. So it's not so easy for me to have data protection on this slide, although I do like to explain to people that actually data protection is not the same as data governance. They actually should be aligned and support each other these days, but they are not the same discipline. Another thing that gets frequently confused is data retention. So how long you should or must hold data before you delete it. Another thing that all the personal data protection regulation is asking you to do is to make sure you're pretty hot on data retention. So a different discipline again, but as you're learning and can see a bit of a theme here, they need to be aligned and work with each other. And then records management. Now, this one is a really interesting topic because records management normally talks about either physical pieces of paper, but also where your data is in, a part of something else. So if you work for an insurer, it might be part of a policy. If you are a hospital, it would be, the patient's records. So records management follows a lot of the sensible principles of data governance, but it's not the same thing, and it's usually done by different experts within your organization. And then finally, I always like to mention Big Brother, because whenever I'm helping clients do data governance, sooner or later, somebody will say to me, oh, I bet you're going to be just like Big Brother. You're going to be looking over my shoulder at the data. And that's not the case at all. If I'm doing data governance, I'm not looking at the data at all. Now, the data protection people might be, but as a data governance person, I don't want to look at your data. I actually want to find the people in your organization who care about the data and want to look at it and understand its quality. So, hopefully we're now all clear what data governance is, and we're clear where it isn't. So now it's time to look at the data protection, which is handily highlighted, and try and explain to you, how they work together these days. So, as I already kind of said, in years gone by, it was like there was a brick wall between data protection and data governance. They were done by totally separate teams within an organization who, to be honest, had no reason to talk to each other. And, particularly, I'll talk about the UK because obviously that is where I live and I understand better what goes on here in terms of the regulation. But our old Data Protection Act, before we had GDPR, actually said as long as you protected the data, so it didn't get, you didn't have data breaches, you didn't give it to anybody who shouldn't have it, you met the regulations. So that data could be absolute rubbish. It could be really poor quality, but that didn't break that regulation. So it was only on the right-hand side of the line that we were worrying about the quality of that data, and another team entirely were protecting that data. The two people never spoke. But what I find now is that with GDPR led the way, but the others are just almost like reinforcing it, is that wall has disappeared. And we've now got a bit of a symbiotic relationship, we could say. Maybe not symbiotic, because you wouldn't do, you don't do one without the other, for some areas, it would be perfectly okay to do data governance, obviously on non-personal data. But what I'm finding now is that you need data governance in place to meet some of the data protection requirements. Now let's have a little bit of a look at those, and I can explain you a little bit more. So as you can see on the top of the slide, I've called this GDPR requirements because that came first, and it would have got a really long title if I'd listed all the data protection regulations that I've had to look at for my clients over the last couple of years. But there seems to be a bit of a recurring theme coming here. So they cover a number of different requirements. Now, any of you that have seen any of my other webinars or done my training know that I believe in simplifying things. And when I first started getting involved in GDPR, I thought I'm going to have to look at this and get my head around it. And let's be honest, anybody that's looked at any data protection regulations know simple is not a word you would describe them by. But it's just, you have to simplify these things to help people get their head around it. So I spent some time going through the requirements, and I kind of put them into 6 buckets so that I could get my head around what each of them meant. So, if you start at the top left, we have data protection. And by this, I mean what I consider the true data protection requirements, as they would have been before. These are the encryption, who has access to that data, what is it, is it being used for the allowed use, consent management, are you allowed to hold this data, privacy notices, all those kind of, the things that you really need a data protection expert to look at. So they're all in that bucket. Now I started looking at things that perhaps, now we've had GDPR, were not so pure data protection. So you've got things like data retention, which I've already mentioned, how long we can hold our data before we have to delete it. So that's not pure data protection, and it's not data governance, but we need to, understand how long we hold our data, or should hold our data. Now, one of the other new requirements was around accountability. So, and when I say accountability, I don't mean you can just have a data protection officer and tick the box and everything's fine. When you actually read the detail of the regulations, they're actually asking for people who really do understand the detail of that data, and that they understand, what that data is, what it's being used for. Well, to me, that sounds a lot like the data owners I put in place when I'm doing data governance. So, that's accountability. Now, location is really important under GDPR and the other new regulations. It's not good enough just to say, yes, we've got personal data. You actually have to say, we have personal data. It's on this system and at this point in the globe. Are we storing our data in the cloud? In which case, which country is it actually being held in? So that's another set of requirements. Now, accuracy was a nice, interesting one that goes back, to what I was saying before. It is not, acceptable anymore for the data to be poor quality. If you've got me on your database and you have my date of birth, it's not good enough to say, oh, well, it's a valid date, so it must be Nicola's date of birth. It really has to be my date of birth for you to be able to meet these requirements. So accuracy has now come in as a really big requirement. And then finally, we've got what GDPR called integrity, but tends to look at a little bit of maybe other dimensions of data quality, but also data security. So the access management, who has access to that data, and should they? So I've given you a quick walkthrough of, my simplification of the requirements. So let's look at how data governance can help you do that. So if you follow the lines across, you can see if we start from the second one down on the right on GDPR, data retention. Now I've put this as a dotted line because, as you've already heard me say, I don't believe that data retention is data governance and it's not data protection. But if you've put a good data governance framework in place, you have data owners and data stewards in place. And if you have a data owner, then I can't think of anybody better in your organization to be making a decision with obviously input from legal and compliance teams, but they should be making the decision on how long you hold data before it's deleted, or how long you hold data. As a short-term thing, because some data can only be held shorter than other periods. The next one down, we have accountability, which, I may have hinted very strongly at the previous slide. But accountability is people who actually know what that data is. Well, that sounds a bit like a data owner to me. So, actually, you can see that having data owners in place is a big tick in the box for data protection. Now, we have location. So, if you have data governance in place, you're going to have a few things. Now, firstly, you're going to have some data definitions, and you're going to have them in a data or business glossary, depending on whatever you call it. And that your definitions in your glossary are going to include things like which systems they're held on, which systems does it travel through, where does that data go to when it leaves your organization, where does it come to from before your organization. And that is all useful information that can be stored in your glossary. And perhaps you've got a business glossary already, but you don't have that information, then just add it. It is really, really simple to do that. And I have helped, a number of clients build on their existing glossary to hold that information, the additional information that's required to meet your protection requirements. Why store it somewhere else? You should have it in something that's easily accessible. Have it in your master reference source for this is everything we know about our data. Now, all those things I was just describing, also describing where the data has come from, where it's going to, you can document in a graphical form or a diagram. And that's called data lineage or sometimes data flow. And particularly GDPR calls it data flow. If I'm just doing pure data governance, I tend to call it data lineage unless a client prefers to call it data flow. But that is another requirement under GDPR and the other data protection regulations, that you do have documented how the data flows through your organization. So this is going to be a big win if you've already got data governance in place. You either already have that data flow in place, or you've got the skills and knowledge to be able to actually pull one together really quickly because you know what they are and you know how they can be built very easily. Now, we've got accuracy next. Now, I think accuracy is met by three of the things that data governance gives you. It gives you a process for how you manage data quality issues, how you notify them all the way through to resolving them. As a result of having that, you should have improved data quality in your organization, which helps you tick the accuracy box. And also, as a result of having data governance, you should be having data quality reporting in place. And again, if you have data quality reports in place, the whole point of doing that is to monitor and improve quality of data. So again, that should give you another big tick in the box for accuracy. And then finally, you recall when I was talking about integrity, I think the way GDPR in particular describes it, that is a mixture of data security, but also perhaps the other ways of managing data quality. So the same three things that data governance gives you also ticks the box on integrity. So having gone through those, I hope you're starting to see that, if you've got data governance in place, it's going to be so much easier to meet your data protection regulation because you're not starting from scratch. You've actually got a foundation, and even if perhaps your data governance framework doesn't extend to all the personal data that's in the scope of the regulation, you've got that foundation in place that you can easily use. You're not starting a program from scratch to try and understand and document your personal data. So when I've been working with clients who've actually used their data governance framework to support data protection, then it was an easy sell. But I've actually helped people actually implement data governance because they had to do data protection. So one of the things I would say is you can either sell it as we've already got data governance, we can help you do this. We can help make meeting the data protection requirements so much easier. Or perhaps you can use your data protection program as a really good leverage to start doing data governance. I'm never one to miss an opportunity to get people to do data governance because there are so many benefits from doing it. And you can see some of the ones that you might get on the screen here. So efficiency, things might take less time. You'll have better, accurate reports for people to make decisions on. You're going to be complying with various regulations, not just data protection. If you're in financial services, a lot of financial services companies have regulations that require data governance. So you're actually now seeing a bit of a picture building that we can meet multiple regulations by having one really good data governance framework in place. Actually, just having good quality data is going to protect your reputation, as will meeting data protection regulations. Having data governance governance in place is actually key requirement to be able to do any master data and produce a single version of whichever truth it is that you want, whether that's customers or suppliers or products. And then finally, so many companies start embarking on a strategy to deliver anything. But these days, I think a digitalization or a data-driven transformation seems to be really hot topics. You can't do that if you don't understand your data and you don't know how good it is and where it is. So, obviously I'm laboring the point. I really am a great fan, obviously, of data governance, and I think there are huge benefits for everybody in embracing it. So if you're not already doing data governance, the data protection regulations are a really good lever you can use to actually get data governance in at the same time, because it will help you deliver the data protection regulations in a more sustainable and, successful manner. And if you do have data governance in place already, that's great. This is another use case for you to explain and demonstrate why putting in data governance was the right thing for your organization. So, do I think it's a match made in heaven? Well, maybe that's exaggerating a little bit. But actually, from going back to that few years ago when I'm telling people that data governance and data protection had nothing to do with each other, I actually think now that there really are a really good relationship between the two. And, if you want to meet your data protection regulations as well as you can do, then you need to embrace data governance. So that was kind of my overview of how data governance can help you meet your regulations. And I think we've got time for a few questions now, haven't we, Piotr?
Yes. Thank you for your presentation. That was very informative. You can start asking your questions in the tab on the right side. But before we do answer them, let me give you 2 minutes to present how you can find and classify and have a repository of your sensitive information in your databases. Let me share my screen to show you our tool. Okay, I hope you see the screen with the tool. This is Data this is Data Desktop. What you see over here is a data dictionary. This is the specification of the data in your databases. You could import many different databases, all of them into one repository, and then you can use tags or labels, like in this case here. So these are the tables, and these are the columns of a specific table, and you can see here the classification for, in particular, GDPR. You can have multiple classifications, like PII, for instance. And you can have a sensitivity level, like in the column over here. And you can also have additional fields like domain, that's what we call it, and that will help you distinguish between different kinds of data. So you can build that repository quite easily. You simply populate the repository with your with the metadata imported from your databases. You just connect, and it's scanned automatically. Then you hit the button for let's say PII. Now the data is searching the data, and here are the suggestions. So these are the columns we think might hold the information, and we suggest you the sensitivity level and the type of the information. So all that are just suggestions. You can all review that and curate it. So let's use this domain field to search for email. I have just a couple of databases over here, like a data warehouse, CRM, and maybe one other database. And you can see how many times email field occurs in those databases. They are not particularly large. So in any real scenario, you'll have lots and lots of fields like that. And managing that, finding that would be very difficult as a manual process. So that's why we built this functionality to help you. Once I save it, these fields are then populated here, and as I said, in the other classifications as well. You can add additional fields that could maybe define the retention and other attributes Nicola was talking about. You can then curate it manually and share in the documentation accessible for everyone. You can see the data dictionary over here and those classifications, so that everyone in your organization can see what kind of personal data you are processing. Okay, that's it. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of that, quick demo. If you'd like to learn more, I'm hosting a webinar on 15th of January. And I will talk more in detail about how you can do it and how you can find this data, tag it, and share it. Okay, that's it for the presentation. Now we can get to questions.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. Now, I think working on a greenfield site would be an absolute luxury because you've actually got you've got the opportunity to actually get good data governance in place from the start and really influence people to do things properly. So I would say, yes, wouldn't it be lovely if we could get data governance in place on day one? I think it's unlikely that anybody would have data governance in place before they had any data. So I guess that actually even on a greenfield, I'm expecting that you probably would have to work backwards a little bit and start, understanding what data you've got and is it really what you think you've got there. But I think the question about doing it in order with GDPR, GDPR in particular, well, and to be honest, all the other data protection regulations that have come into effect are not optional. So I don't think you could wait and do data governance first. I think you would have to do them in parallel because you have to comply with GDPR. So you can't then just sit back and say, well, if the ICO came and asked you, and for anybody who's not in the UK, that's the regulator that manages GDPR in the UK. If they came and asked you to demonstrate how you were complying and you said, oh, well, we're not doing it yet because we're doing data governance first, I don't think they'd accept that. So I think you'd have to do it in parallel, and just make sure that perhaps, you do your data governance framework of your personal data first. Data governance takes a very long time. I think it would probably take less time on greenfield. But I think that you always have to do it in phases, even if you've got that luxury of everything being clean and perhaps no legacy systems and a nice and uncomplicated systems architecture, which I'm obviously assuming. But I think you always have to do it in phases, and I think a greenfield would be no different. So in that instance, I would recommend that if you put data governance in place, its first phase would be focusing on the GDPR data.
Thank you. We are still waiting for more questions.
Okay.
Please use this opportunity. We have an expert over here. So in the meantime, Nicola, maybe you have some questions that are frequently occurring from your LinkedIn profile or from the community.
I think I'm trying to think what the main questions are that I get asked. I think a lot of people kind of say, but why is it data governance? What's it got to do with it? But I think my answers tend to be everything that I've already gone through in this webinar. It's because it gives you the accountability and the people. But I also think it gives you that network, because if you are the data governance manager or you're on the data governance team, you as a very kind of fact that you're doing data governance, you've built up a really good network across the organization. So it actually makes it a lot quicker and easier for you to identify the right people to be going out to and talking to about personal data and collecting all the information you need. So I think that, if people try to say to you, you're nothing to do with it, I would push back on them. I've spoken to some people where the data governance manager is either on the data protection team or has a dotted line to them, where they've actually understood the value, how data governance can really support the meeting data protection regulations.
Okay, we're still waiting for new questions. Let me ask one. So the functionality I just shown you, the data classification, whose responsibility is it to find and tag those this information, to provide this metadata?
So now I don't know about type, but I would say whose responsibility is it? I think it's got to be down to the data owner. That's kind of what they sign up to do when they're being a data owner. They're accountable for that data, and that includes knowing what that data is, and what it can and can't be used for. So I think that quite easily rests with them. They can't wriggle out of that one. I get that they probably don't have the time and everything, but that's why, I tend to give them data stewards to go and do the work for them. Now, I think if you were maintaining a business glossary on an Excel spreadsheet, then I think it's likely that you're going to need a central resource, perhaps your data governance team, perhaps your data protection program team that's helping you meet it. They would be having to document that because you couldn't have multiple versions of a spreadsheet. But then that's the joy. Then if you have a tool like Datato, it actually makes it a lot easier to actually put that responsibility out on the business to do themselves. So I would expect probably not the data owners, let's be honest, they're going to be too senior, but probably the data stewards would be responsible for making sure that those classifications are agreed and loaded up into the glossary.
Okay, so this is the place where data protection team and data governance team need to work together, right?
Absolutely.
So the data protection needs to ask for these classifications. And yeah, as you said, the data, or spreadsheet or something else is the tool to communicate, right?
Yes. Yeah, it just facilitates the whole thing and makes it so much easier than having multiple versions of spreadsheets floating around an organization. Okay, we have a question from Felix. In your opinion, how does data governance be linked to overall data strategy? Well, that's kind of a really interesting question, because I can't tell you the answer unless I knew what the strategy was. Because I would say in a generic way that actually your data strategy should actually be all about what do you need to do with data at your organization to meet your corporate strategy. I've seen examples of data strategies where it's almost just like a wish list of whoever wrote it. We want master data management, we want data governance, we want tools for everything, we want this, that, and the other. And they then get a bit bewildered as to why they don't deliver anything and they don't get signed off and nothing happens. And that's because that's just like a data geek's wish list. These are the things that we know our company ought to do, and we just list it in a document and call it a data strategy. But the good data strategies that I've seen actually look at what's your corporate strategy and what do we need to do to make sure that our data is good enough to meet that? And is that, improve the quality of it? Is it to source more data? Is it just to actually understand what data we've got in the first place so that we could do some clever analytics on it? And I think that's where the data governance bit fits in, is that wherever you realize that you need, one, to understand your data, or two, to improve the quality of it in order to meet your corporate strategy, then data governance is one big part of your data strategy, because if you don't have it already, you're going to need to have it to deliver those things.
Mm-hmm. Another question from me. You focused on the webinar on the GDPR. Obviously, you have most experience with it. But how does all those data protection acts from different countries, like you said, mentioned India, Australia, and there's a CCPA in California. Yes. How do you approach that? How does that data governance can help address all of them at once?
So, I think it's because not all of them, but most of them have this requirement that actually they apply to the citizens of that country, regardless of where they are in the world. So you end up finding that you're going to have to meet more than one of these. So I think that's why data governance helps, because you don't want a project that says, I need to document all of this over here to meet the Indian requirements. I need to do all this to meet the CCPA. And I've been doing a lot of research the last couple of weeks on the Thai PDPA, because a client asked me to. But they're all kind of saying the same things. They're not identical. And some of them, the words, the roles and responsibilities are slightly different, but they come down to the same principles. So if you remember the slide where I came up with like the 6 buckets of requirements, then actually, all of the data protection requirements that I've had a look at all tend to fit in those. Now, bear in mind, I'm not a data protection expert. I've not gone through them with a fine tooth comb, but time and time again, when you look at the descriptions of them and what they want, they all fit into those buckets. So therefore, data governance helps you meet them and do it once centrally, not having multiple different kind of documentations to meet everybody. So it might be that you have to evolve your business glossary and add another field because a new regulation comes along, and perhaps CCPA is going to ask for something very specific and very new that we haven't been asked for by anything else. But that's the joy of doing it in your glossary rather than having a separate, this is my document to meet CCPA. Because we can just say, we'll add another column in and we'll start doing this. And we'll just say, for any data that's, under the scope of CCPA, we need to also capture this, whatever that might be. So I think that, the fact that you probably have to meet multiple ones is actually just even strengthens the case for having good data governance in place to make it easier for you to do that.
I would agree, yes. But those regulations differ in terms of the scope of the data they require. They consider sensitive and different sensitivity levels. So I've seen that American PII has different levels. This is something I shown on the drop downs, I think. Levels than GDPR. GDPR has a category called special category of sensitive data, and this is something very European.
Yes, and I think that's where clients that I've had, and I'm ever so sorry, Piotr, but they've kind of used a spreadsheet. But what we've kind of done is said that you have a column that says is this data in scope of GDPR, yes or no, and if you put yes, then you might have to fill in the next 5 columns.
That's.
And then what you do is the next regulation, you suddenly say, well, actually, it's 3 of those 5 columns are the same. So we can make them the generic personal data protection fields. And then we've now got 2 of them are GDPR specific, but we've got another 2 that are perhaps CCPA. And you can just build it up like that. So and that's where I think data governance really comes into its own, because it helps you come up with what's common, what doesn't have to be repeated and kept in sync. We can start building up and get this really good picture and say, well, actually, this is classified differently in Australia and actually in, India, this is called this. But we can start building that up and really, making it easier for people to meet this myriad of requirements.
Okay, so whose responsibility would be, my previous question was whose responsibility is to actually provide those classifications, those labels, but whose responsibility is to provide the guidelines for it? So that's a good question. So I would say that that's definitely down to your data protection team. Because they're going to be the experts. As I said, I think now data protection regulations are asking for things that are much wider than the old style of data protection, and they stray into other areas. But I think that pure data protection stuff, that needs to be looked at by a data protection expert. So that needs to be your team that says, to meet this requirement, we need to classify data according to the following, and these are the definitions of these classifications. And then it's over to your data owners and data stewards to say, well, I own this data, it's classified as this under whichever regulation. So the way I understand it, then data protection team is a client of a data governance product process, right? That's
one way of putting it, yeah.
Okay.
When I've been helping data governance teams in organizations that were also doing like their GDPR programs, they've built really good relationships with the data protection team, because the data protection team have understood that they were helping them, making their life a lot easier.
Okay, we have no more questions. I also don't have any more questions. So if you're watching this after the webinar ended, the recording will be available. Then please don't hesitate, reach out and ask your question. We'll try to get that answered. Nicola, thank you very much. It was very, very insightful.
Thank you.
I have much more understanding of the relationships between data protection and data governance. It was not clear for me before. So it gives me a good idea of where we fit in. Thank you for your presentation. Hope to see you all sometime next year, and hope to see you all as well.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed any chance to explain how data governance is a good thing is great. Thank you, Piotr.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, and hope to see you on the next webinar.